with the phosphate solution. That sounds very interesting.
Well, I'll do my best to make it as interesting as possible. Thank you so much for all giving up your Thursday evening to listen to me talk. Hopefully you'll learn something new, I hope. So as Constanza said, I'm Dr. Elaine McGoff. I have a PhD in freshwater ecology and an advanced diploma in planning and environmental law. And I worked on freshwater for about 20 years, and I'm head of advocacy with An Taisce and vice chair of SWAN, the Sustainable Water Network. So yeah, I want to talk to you about how Ireland has a nitrates problem with a phosphate solution. If my screens behave, my slides behave. There we go. So first things first, let's talk about the Nitrates Directive. So the Nitrates Directive came into force in 1991, and its main aim is to protect water quality from agricultural nitrate pollution. So it requires member states to draft up nitrates action programs every 4 years, which set out the measures that are being put in place to protect water quality, like the dates for spreading slurry or setback distances, things like that. And under the Nitrates Directive, the maximum limit of nitrogen, organic nitrogen per hectare is 170 kilos per hectare. But Annex 3 of the directive allows for a higher amount on the condition that member state meets certain criteria, like a long growing season, soils with high denitrification capacity. And that is essentially what gives rise to the nitrates derogation, which I presume most of you know what it is, but just in short, it's basically where you're allowed to apply a greater level of nitrogen, organic nitrogen per hectare once you apply to the Department of Agriculture for a derogation license. So where are we at in Ireland? Well, water quality has been in decline for a decade, slightly more, and it started as a result of the lifting of the dairy quotas. Things have been fairly solid up until maybe 2013, and then things began to rapidly go downhill. So since 2010, there's been about a 40% increase in dairy cow numbers, and the majority of that increase has happened in Munster and Leinster. And artificial fertilizer has increased in lockstep with this by about 34% in the same time period. And you can see from this graph how out of step we are with our European colleagues in terms of our drastic increase in cow numbers. So Ireland is the green bar right at the end, and you can see we are just head and shoulders above other European member states in terms of the change in cow numbers from 2010 to 2019. Now, bearing in mind that the Nitrates Directive has now been in force for over 30 years, it's worth noting that half of our rivers and lakes and 2/3 of our estuaries are in less than good status under the Water Framework Directive. And agriculture is the biggest driver of that water pollution. The two main pollutants of water quality are nitrate and phosphate. And the relationship between the Water Framework Directive and the Nitrates Directive, it's quite straightforward. The Water Framework Directive relies on the Nitrates Directive to provide the basic measures. So basically the measures that are put in all water bodies on all farms. And the current River Basin Management Plan and the new draft River Basin Management Plan relies really heavily on the Nitrates Action Programme, which comes from the Nitrates Directive, to provide the protection that water needs from agricultural processes. So remembering that a condition of getting the derogation was that it doesn't impact on water quality, have a look at this map. So on the left are the areas which are impacted by nitrate pollution. So that's the yellow, orange and red areas. They're high in nitrates. And on the right is a location of derogation farms. Now, there's a very clear spatial overlap between the two. The occurrence of nitrate pollution coincides with areas of free draining soil. And free draining soil is the best agricultural soil in Ireland. It's best for growing grass and crops. So that's where the most intensive agriculture and dairy happens. So just to be clear, it's not just the derogation farms that are driving this trend, but they're very much acting like fuel to the fire. We have this lovely free draining soil. That's where we pack on all of our cows. That leads to huge increases in nitrate pollution. And water pollution is complicated. So it's not as simple as whatever goes on the land then runs off. So when thinking of nitrate, there are a couple of things which can make a really big difference. besides just the amount of nitrogen you put on the land. Soil type is a really big factor. So in Ireland, we tend to have very heavy soils in the west and free draining soils in the south and the southeast. If you think back to the map I just showed you, where all of those like red dots are, that's where the free draining soil generally is, and where the nitrate is high. And as I said, the two main pollutants of water quality are nitrate and phosphate. And both of these behave differently depending on the soil type. To put it really simply, phosphate is sticky. It sticks to soil and organic matter. So it doesn't tend to move that well down through the soil. The phosphate pollution pathways are generally via overland flow, or when it sticks to silt and runs off into the water. So the photo on the left is a really classic example of where you know that there's a lot of phosphate and a lot of silt flowing over the land into the nearest water body. Nitrate, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's not at all sticky. It moves really readily down through the soil. So overland flow isn't that big a driver for nitrate loss. The main pathway is that it just shoots straight down through free draining soil. So logically, phosphate pollution is more of a problem on the heavy clay soils, which tend to have the overland flow paths. Nitrate pollution is a problem where water moves freely down through the soil. And the EPA data would show you that the nitrate problem is primarily in the south and southeast. The phosphate is more dispersed depending on where the heavy soil happens, often in the north and the west. Right, you could well be asking yourself why you're getting a lecture on the nitrogen cycle from me, but bear with me, because it's really important to understand this with a view to understanding why we have ended up in the situation where we are. Why have we had the Nitrates Directive in place for 30 years and our water quality is still going down the toilet? What are we doing wrong? Well, the first problem is that there's a huge focus on farmyard inspection and improving compliance via that. Now, that's fine. You know, it's important in terms of preventing, you know, E. coli and phosphorus and silt. But when it comes to nitrate pollution, the issue is nitrate leaching down through the soils. So what's happening in the yard isn't actually particularly relevant. It matters, as I said, for phosphate and other contamination, but not for nitrogen, because Teagasc modelling has shown that the main driver of nitrate loss is actually urine patches. It's cattle when they're out of the field urinating, like this lovely, delightful photo I put there for you all to enjoy. So urine patches account for about 63% of the nitrogen we're losing from farmland. 29% comes from chemical fertilizer and only 8% comes from slurry. This is a really, really key thing to remember, because you don't hear anybody else saying this. You hear a lot of talk about slurry and compliance and how that, you know, if we fix all our slurry problems, everything will be fine. But nobody's talking about urine patches. It's such a glamorous thing to talk about. I talk about urine patches all the time, but you don't hear other people talking about urine patches. This is really important to know. Because it's actually our grass-based system which is driving the nitrate loss, namely the amount of cattle we have on free draining land. The more cows you have urinating on the land, the more nitrate we're going to lose. And the irony is that, you know, we're very busy congratulating ourselves on how long our cattle are out of pasture, how we have this wonderful grass-based system. But from a nitrate loss point of view, that actually just exacerbates the problem. So speaking purely from a nitrogen perspective and a nitrogen use efficiency point of view, housed cattle are actually far more nitrogen efficient than those that are at pasture. So the average nitrogen use efficiency of a cow, like when you feed a cow nitrogen, it only absorbs about 20% of the nitrogen they eat. They lose 80% of it to the environment, largely through urine. So you can have the most nitrogen efficient farm in the world, but whatever you grow, you're still feeding it through the cow, and 80% of that is going to be lost. So the cows are the ultimate predictor of how much nitrogen is lost. And it's quite hard to get much further beyond a 20% efficiency or uptake by the cow. Tillage, on the other hand, has a far higher nitrogen use efficiency. So again, purely with, you know, thinking about nitrogen, if you wanted to make a dairy farm more nitrogen efficient, you would actually house the cattle, use the slurry on the tillage land where the nitrogen is used much more efficiently, put it, bring it back into the cows, they would eat it, they'd lose it in the slurry, and you would reapply the slurry where it was going to be taken up quite well by the crops. Now, obviously, from an animal welfare point of view, I don't agree with this, but it's just for the purposes of explaining why our pasture-based system poses a problem for nitrogen loss. And there is no way to adequately mitigate for that. You can make a certain amount of small gains by feeding cattle less protein, because nitrogen and protein are sort of the same thing. So feed cows less nitrogen in their concentrate. But at the end of the day, cattle are inefficient users of nitrogen. And if they're out of pasture, grass is really high in nitrogen. If they're out of pasture eating high nitrogen grass, we're going to continue to lose the bulk of that nitrogen to the environment. It's just how cows are designed. There's no way around it. Now, the reason it's important to know all this is that there are certain messages being put out from the likes of Teagasc and others that don't quite tally with what the EPA are saying. The one I heard most recently from the Teagasc Agricultural Catchments Programme is that the load of nitrogen going onto a field has no bearing on the amount of nitrate lost, up to 250 kilograms of nitrogen, and that soil and rain are the driving factors. But there are oodles of international studies proving that the main driver of nitrogen loss in free draining soil is the excess nitrogen going onto the area. It's really very well established science. The nitrogen isn't coming down in the rain. It's not being spontaneously added by the soil. So it's logical that the more nitrogen you put into a system, the more nitrogen you're going to lose. And yes, the weather and the soil do change how quickly that happens. But on free draining soil, the load loss relationship is really clear. And the reason that Teagasc and others are saying soil is the main driver is because they're kind of lumping all soil types together, both heavy and free draining. Now, as I've said, on heavy soils, you don't have a clear relationship between how much nitrogen you put on and how much comes off. We only see that in the free draining soils. But if you put all of the soil types in together, you're going to get a kind of a muddy message. You're not going to see a very clear correlation. And that's what they're doing. They are lumping them all in together to conclude that nitrogen load isn't related to nitrogen loss because they have a whole mix of soils in there. So I'd say it's not particularly good science or good science communication. I think that the messaging, it makes for confusing messaging for farmers. So what does this mean for measures? Well, where nitrate loss is the problem, you have catchments like the Slaney and the Barrow, where I think it's almost 50% too much nitrogen is going into those rivers. The only way to adequately address that is to reduce the excess nitrogen in the system. So things like buffer zones, better slurry storage, low emission slurry spreading, protected urea, all of these are measures which farmers are putting in place and which you will hear the IFA and Teagasc talking about, in various talks and on the radio. But the thing is, they're beneficial for many things, but they're not very effective for nitrogen. So, for example, buffer zones, they're really good for intercepting overland flow. If you think back to that photo I showed you of the muddy water, they would be really good in that situation for stopping phosphate and silt. But nitrogen's going down through the soil, so they're not very useful for that. Low emission slurry spreading, it essentially injects the slurry into the soil. But if the soil is free draining and the nitrate is going straight down through it, in a way, it probably almost speeds it up. Same with protected urea. It's good for ammonia emissions, but it does very little for nitrogen or for water quality. But that message isn't being effectively communicated, which is leading to frustration in farming circles, because they would argue they're adopting all of these measures, but ultimately the main nitrate driver is not being addressed, and that's urine patches. So farmers are being put in a very difficult situation because they're being told, do X, Y, and Z and everything will be grand. But X, Y, and Z aren't addressing urine patches. Everyone is ignoring urine patches. And again, I just want to point out that it's not just irrigation farms which are driving this. I mean, all farms in a catchment will leak a certain amount of nitrogen. And you can have intensive dairy farms that aren't in derogation because they're exporting their slurry. But you can imagine they'd have quite high stocking density out in their pastures. So they could be as problematic, if not more problematic, than derogation farms. And what about Timoleague? I don't know if any of you have heard about Timoleague. I hear an awful lot about Timoleague. It's one particular catchment down in Cork. It's one of the Teagasc agricultural test catchments. And it appears to be bucking the trend with an improvement in water quality while stocking density remained the same. So what's happening here? Why is this different? What's miraculous about Timoleague? The timeline here is key. In 2018 into 2019, nitrogen peaked in many catchments. And that was because we had a drought. In the summer of 2018, we had a really bad drought. The grass stopped growing, and Teagasc would admit themselves that they gave bad advice. They told farmers to lash on fertilizer to try and prompt grass growth. So an awful lot of fertilizer went on the ground. There was no rain. Nothing happened, and then it rained and we got a massive peak of nitrogen. All that fertilizer was flushed through the system, and we got some of the highest levels, I think the highest levels of nitrogen in our rivers that we've ever seen. So they started the clock for this timeline. You can see in the headline on the right there, the catchments, the nitrogen levels have reduced between 2019. They started the clock when nitrogen was at an all-time peak. And they stopped it. This headline stops it in 2022. They stopped the clock in 2022. In 2022, water levels again were quite low. And a lot of the water from the Timoleague was coming from groundwater. And that groundwater is far cleaner than surface water. So it's naturally really low in nitrogen. So they started the clock at the very, very peak. And they have stopped the clock when nitrogen levels were lower than normal because it was groundwater fed. Now, I saw this coming. The pattern has now fallen apart since 2022 because it rained and things went back to normal. So we're not seeing this miraculous trend anymore. But we are still constantly hearing about it from Teagasc and agricultural lobbyists and certain politicians who talk about how we need to take guidance from Timoleague. And there's been, pushback on the EPA science. And a lot of the people who are pushing back on the EPA science are saying, well, look at Timoleague, do what they do in Timoleague. But it's worth bearing in mind that Timoleague has been consistently in breach of the nitrate levels since it was established. It has twice the level of nitrate it should have. Phosphate is 3 times the level, and the biology is unsatisfactory rather. This is one of the most studied catchments in Ireland, with advisors and scientists working with farmers there since 2008, and it's still consistently in breach of nitrate and phosphate. So whatever you hear, just remember that ecologically speaking, it's actually not a good news story. And I don't think it bodes well for other intensive catchments. If they can't get it right in Timoleague, where you have this much intervention, then how can we hope to get it right in catchments where they have far less intervention and less advisors? And I'll just finish on this with a look ahead. Obviously, the Commission are now starting to step in. And the Commissioner was here last November, and he made it very clear that the future of Ireland's derogation is hanging in the balance. It's hard to know if that will change with the predicted swing to the right in the European Parliament. I mean, we're already seeing the Commission ripping up environmental protections for agriculture. But Ireland is looking increasingly isolated because we're going to be the only country in Europe which will be seeking a derogation come 2026. Now, so far, I don't see any plans being put in place to support derogation farmers if we do lose it. I believe we're playing a very risky game with farmers' livelihood.